The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above Jerry's diner as midnight crept in. Rain tapped against the windows, creating a gentle rhythm that mixed with the clink of coffee cups and the quiet murmur of late-night conversations. Behind the counter, Rose wiped down the coffee maker for the third time that night, humming a tune that had been stuck in her head since her daughter sang it at breakfast. The bell above the door chimed as a group of truck drivers walked in, their boots squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Rose grabbed her notepad and pen, tucking a stray curl behind her ear as she headed toward their table. 10 years of working the graveyard shift had taught her that every customer had a story, and these quiet hours between midnight and dawn were when the best ones came out. "What can I get you folks tonight?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth that kept regulars coming back. As they ordered their usual midnight feast of eggs, hash browns, and endless coffee refills, Rose's fingers tapped quietly against her notepad, turning their simple orders into a beat only she could hear. Between refilling coffee cups and bringing out plates of steaming food, Rose pulled out the wrinkled order tickets from her apron pocket. The back of each one was covered with words she'd scribbled throughout her shift, little pieces of songs that came to her while she worked. Some were about the lonely souls who wandered in at 3 a.m., others about her own dreams that seemed just out of reach, like stars visible through the diner's windows, but too far to touch. Her daughter's school photo smiled up at her from behind the counter, reminding her why she kept going. Little Amy was only 8, but she already had her mother's love for music, always making up silly songs about her day at school. Rose had promised herself that Amy would have every opportunity she never had, even if it meant working double shifts and putting her own dreams on hold. The night moved on as it always did, a slow dance of coffee pots and plate deliveries. Mr. Chen from the convenience store next door came in for his usual midnight snack, telling Rose about his grandson's first steps while she poured his decaf. Old Mrs. Patterson ordered her late-night toast and talked about the songs they used to play at dance halls when she was young. Each story, each conversation, found its way onto the back of another order ticket, becoming verses and choruses that Rose would quietly sing to herself while restocking sugar packets. Around 3 a.m., during the quietest part of her shift, Rose stood by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, tired eyes but a determined smile. She was still wearing the same uniform she'd bought secondhand when she started this job, but somehow it had become like a second skin, comfortable in its familiarity. The sound of the radio cutting out pulled her from her thoughts. The ancient machine had been acting up all week, and now the kitchen was uncomfortably quiet without its usual background noise. Without thinking, Rose started singing softly, one of her own songs filling the silence. It was about late-night dreams and coffee-stained hopes, about watching life go by through a diner window while holding onto something bigger. Joey, the cook who'd worked there even longer than she had, poked his head through the kitchen window. "You ought to do something with that voice of yours," he said, not for the first time. Rose just smiled and shook her head, grabbing the coffee pot for another round of refills. But as she moved between tables, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to sing somewhere other than this diner, to share the songs that lived in her heart with more than just the midnight crowd. The sun would rise soon, bringing with it the morning rush and the end of another night shift. Rose gathered her order tickets, now covered in lyrics, and tucked them safely into her bag. Maybe tomorrow night, she'd finally find the courage to share one of her songs with someone other than the empty diner. Or maybe she'd just keep adding to her collection of coffee-stained dreams, one order ticket at a time. The Tuesday night crowd at Jerry's diner was thinner than usual, which meant Rose had more time to notice the older gentleman who'd been coming in every night for the past 3 weeks. He always sat in the same corner booth, ordered a slice of apple pie with black coffee, and stayed for exactly 2 hours. But it wasn't his routine that caught her attention. It was the way he listened. Most people came to the diner looking down at their phones or lost in their own thoughts. But this man, with his silver-streaked hair and worn leather jacket, watched everything with eyes that seemed to catch every detail. He'd pause his fork midway to his mouth whenever Rose hummed while refilling sugar dispensers, and she'd caught him tapping his fingers along with the rhythm of her movements more than once. Tonight, he brought a newspaper with him, but Rose noticed he hadn't turned a single page in the last hour. Instead, he'd been watching her transform a rude customer's complaint into a quiet melody as she worked. The customer had thrown a fit about his eggs being too runny, but instead of letting it ruin her night, Rose had turned his angry words into a funny little song she sang under her breath while restocking napkins. "You do that a lot," he said when she came to refill his coffee. His voice was gentle, with the kind of warmth that reminded her of old vinyl records. Turn the hard moments into music. Rose felt her cheeks warm up, embarrassed that someone had noticed her habit. "Oh, it's just something silly I do to pass the time," she said, trying to brush it off. But he smiled, pulling out a business card that had seen better days. "I'm Robert," he said, sliding the card across the table. "I used to work in the music industry before I retired. Produced some records you might have heard on the radio back in the day." Rose picked up the card, running her thumb over the faded letters. Robert Thompson, music producer. Below that was a list of awards she recognized from country music magazines she'd flipped through during slow shifts. "Those songs you're always humming," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Are they yours?" Rose clutched her order pad tighter, suddenly feeling exposed. The only person who'd ever heard her original songs was her daughter, and that was usually just the silly ones about making breakfast or doing laundry. "They're nothing special," she said. "Just things that pop into my head during shifts." "Nothing special," Robert chuckled. "I heard you turn a complaint about runny eggs into a country blues song that would have made Patsy Cline proud. And last week, you had a whole verse going about the midnight truckers and their stories from the road." Joey, who was cleaning the grill, called out, "She's got hundreds of them written on old order tickets. Been telling her for years she should do something with them." Rose shot Joey a look that could have curdled milk, but Robert's eyes lit up. "Would you show me?" he asked. "Just one." Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, where today's lyrics were scribbled on the backs of receipts and napkins. She'd never shown them to anyone who really knew music before. What if they were terrible? What if all these years of dreaming were just that, dreams? But something in Robert's kind eyes and patient smile made her reach into her pocket. Maybe it was time to let someone else see what she'd been hiding all these years. With slightly shaking hands, she pulled out a crumpled receipt with last night's song about a woman who found her courage in a cup of midnight coffee. As Robert read the lyrics, his expression changed from curiosity to something else. The look of someone who'd just discovered something valuable in an unexpected place. The diner's ancient clock ticked away the seconds as Rose waited, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the late-night regulars could hear it all the way across the room. "You've got something real here," he finally said, looking up at her with eyes that had seen countless musicians come and go. "These aren't just diner songs, Rose. These are real stories, told in a way that could touch people's hearts." Rose stood there, coffee pot still in hand, feeling like her whole world had shifted slightly on its axis. For the first time, her late-night songs didn't feel like just a way to pass the time or cope with difficult customers. They felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and heated debates with herself about whether she'd made the right choice in sharing her secret. But every time she passed Robert's booth, she caught him reading those lyrics again, nodding his head as if hearing a melody only he could understand. The next few nights at Jerry's Diner felt different. Every time the door chimed, Rose found herself looking up, wondering if Robert would be there with his kind eyes and genuine interest in her songs. She'd spent years keeping her music hidden, like a secret garden that only she tended. Now someone else had peeked over the wall, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. One particularly quiet night, Rose sat in Robert's usual booth after her shift ended, spreading out her collection of wrinkled papers across the table. Order tickets, napkins, even the backs of old receipts. Each one held pieces of her life turned into lyrics. Her fingers traced over words written during countless late-night shifts, each song a snapshot of moments that had touched her heart. There was the lullaby she'd written when a young mother came in at 2 a.m., walking her colicky baby around the diner. The bluesy tune of the old trucker who'd lost his wife, but still ordered coffee for two. The hopeful melody about watching the sunrise after a long night shift, believing that each new day brought another chance to chase your dreams. I brought something for you. Robert's voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood there holding an old leather notebook, worn smooth from years of use. Used to carry this when I was still producing. Thought you might put it to better use than I can nowadays. Rose touched the notebook gently, as if it might disappear. The leather was soft, with pages that seemed eager to hold new songs. It was the first real songwriting notebook she'd ever had, so different from her scattered collection of food-stained papers. I can't accept this, she started to say, but Robert was already sliding into the booth across from her. Think of it as an investment in your future, he said, picking up one of her order tickets. These songs, they're not just pretty words, Rose. They're real life, wrapped up in melodies that people need to hear. He pointed to a verse she'd written about watching her daughter sleep while practicing dance moves for her school talent show. This right here. This is what country music was built on. Real stories about real people, trying their best to make it through each day with grace and hope. Rose felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. But I'm just a waitress, she whispered, voicing the doubt that had kept her songs hidden for so long. I don't know anything about making real music. Robert's laugh was gentle. Honey, some of the best songs ever written came from people who were just something. Just a farmer, just a factory worker, just a coal miner's daughter. Being just a waitress means you've got a front row seat to more human stories than most songwriters ever see. He spread out more of her lyrics on the table, creating a patchwork of her late-night observations. Look at these. You've got songs about single mothers working double shifts, old couples sharing pie at midnight, truckers missing their kids' birthdays to make deliveries. These aren't just songs, they're pieces of real life. Joey, who was supposed to be cleaning the grill but had been eavesdropping shamelessly, called out, "Tell her about the recording studio, Mr. Thompson." Rose's heart skipped a beat. Recording studio. Robert nodded slowly. I've got a friend who owns a small studio across town. Nothing fancy, but it's got good equipment and a lot of heart. He owes me a favor, and I thought maybe. Oh no. Rose shook her head quickly, gathering her scattered lyrics. I couldn't. I mean, I've never even sung in front of real people, let alone in a studio. Plus, there's Amy to think about, and my shifts here, and nothing's going to happen that you're not ready for, Robert cut in gently. But Rose, talents like yours don't come along every day. Sometimes life hands you a chance, and the brave thing isn't taking it. It's just being willing to consider it. Rose looked down at the leather notebook, then at her pile of order tickets covered in midnight dreams. She thought about Amy, about all the times she told her daughter to believe in herself and chase her dreams. What kind of example was she setting if she didn't at least try to chase her own? Could I? She paused, taking a deep breath. Could I maybe just see the studio first? Just to look? Robert's smile could have lit up the whole diner. That's all I'm asking for. Sometimes the biggest journeys start with just looking through an open door. As the first rays of sunrise began to peek through the diner windows, Rose carefully placed her scattered lyrics into the new notebook. Each page felt like both an ending and a beginning, the end of keeping her songs hidden, and the beginning of something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The news hit Jerry's diner like a thunderbolt on a clear day. After 37 years of serving the night owls and early birds of the city, the owner was selling the place. Rose stood in front of the notice posted on the break room wall, her hands trembling as she read the words again and again, hoping they might somehow change. 30 days, Joey muttered beside her, his usually cheerful face drawn with worry. That's all they're getting us. 30 days to figure out what comes next. Rose's mind raced to her carefully planned budget, to the jar in her kitchen labeled Amy's school supplies that she'd been filling with extra tips. Her daughter needed new notebooks, pencils, and that scientific calculator her teacher had put on the list. But now, with her steady income about to disappear, every penny would need to be reconsidered. That night, the diner felt different. Every coffee pour, every plate served, every regular customer's smile carried the weight of countdown. Rose found herself memorizing little details she'd taken for granted. The way the neon sign cast pink shadows on the sidewalk, the squeak of the kitchen door, the pattern of cracks in her favorite serving counter. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Robert said when she brought him his usual apple pie. He'd been coming in more frequently since their talk about her songs, always carrying that look of someone who knew something good was about to happen. Rose placed the pie in front of him, and then, against all her usual rules about professionalism, sank into the booth across from him. "They're selling the diner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In 30 days, this all goes away." Robert set down his fork without taking a bite. "Maybe it's not going away," he said carefully. "Maybe it's pushing you towards something new." Rose laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "Something new? I've got a daughter to feed, rent to pay. I can't just follow your dreams," Robert finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, different from the faded one he'd shown her before. "Remember that studio I mentioned? My friend's been asking when you're going to come by. One song, Rose. That's all we're talking about. Just one song to start with." Rose pulled out her new notebook, the leather one Robert had given her. She'd been filling it steadily, transforming her scattered lyrics into proper songs. But between the cost of studio time and the risk of failure, it had remained just a beautiful dream. "I can't afford," she started, but Robert cut her off. "First session's on me. Consider it payment for all the late-night coffee and pie. But Rose, you've got to decide soon. Sometimes life takes away our safe options to push us toward our real path." That night, after her shift, Rose sat in her tiny kitchen, staring at the school supplies jar. Amy was asleep in the next room, her soft breathing carrying through the thin walls. The jar contained exactly $247.32, enough for school supplies, or... With trembling hands, Rose opened her notebook to a song she'd written last week. It was about taking chances, about the dreams that keep you awake at night, about the choices that scare you because they matter so much. She'd written it during her break, watching the sunrise and thinking about all the mornings she'd seen through the diner windows. The next evening, Rose arrived at her shift with dark circles under her eyes, but determination in her step. She'd spent the morning at the discount store, buying the bare minimum of school supplies for Amy. The rest of the money was tucked safely in an envelope, along with a note that read, "Sometimes courage costs everything." When Robert came in for his usual pie, Rose didn't wait for him to ask. She slid into his booth and placed her notebook on the table. "One song," she said, her voice shaking but sure. "But it has to be right, has to be worth it. Because I'm not just doing this for me anymore." Robert smiled, but his eyes were serious. "When do you want to start?" Rose took a deep breath, thinking of Amy's school supplies jar, now half empty but somehow feeling fuller than ever. "Tomorrow," she said. "Before I lose my nerve. Before I talk myself out of being brave." That night, as she served coffee and cleared tables, Rose hummed a different tune. It wasn't a song about waiting or watching life go by. It was a song about jumping even when you're scared, about choosing the uncertain path, because sometimes that's where the best dreams live. The recording studio wasn't what Rose had expected. No fancy equipment or gold records on the walls. Just a small room with soundproofing foam and a microphone that had seen better days. But it had something better than fancy gear. It had heart. And right now, Rose's heart was beating so fast, she thought it might burst right out of her chest. "Just pretend you're back at the diner," Robert encouraged, standing behind the glass partition. "Sing it like you do when you think nobody's listening." Rose closed her eyes, gripping the microphone stand. Her first few attempts had been disasters, her voice shaking so badly she could hardly get through a line. But now, as the afternoon sun filtered through the dusty studio window, she tried to imagine herself back in her comfort zone, wiping tables and humming her songs. Midnight Coffee Dreams, she called this one. It was about those quiet hours when the world seemed to pause, when strangers became friends over cups of coffee, and dreams felt a little more possible. She'd written it during countless late shifts, piecing it together from moments that touched her heart. As the backing track began to play, simple guitar and soft drums that Robert's friend had helped arrange, Rose let herself fall into the story. Her voice, usually confined to the space between coffee pots and countertops, filled the small studio with tales of hope, served up with side orders of faith. 3 hours and countless takes later, they had something. It wasn't perfect, but Robert insisted that its imperfections made it real. Rose left the studio that evening with a simple MP3 file on her phone and a mixture of pride and terror in her heart. Back at the diner, life went on as usual. 23 days remained until the closure, and each shift felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Rose kept her recording secret, too scared to share it with anyone except Amy, who declared it better than the songs on the radio, with all the conviction an 8-year-old could muster. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a typical Tuesday evening. The usual crowd of truckers occupied their regular tables, and Rose was cleaning tables while humming her song. She didn't notice the young college student in the corner, phone in hand, capturing the moment. "You've got to see this," Joey called out the next morning when Rose arrived for her shift. He thrust his phone at her, showing a video that had been posted on social media the night before. There she was, in her faded uniform, moving between tables with practiced ease. But it was her voice that caught attention, clear and true, singing about midnight dreams and coffee-stained hopes while she worked. The caption read, "This waitress at Jerry's Diner has more talent than half the singers on the radio." Listen to her story. Rose watched in horror as Joey scrolled through the comments. Thousands of them. People sharing their own late-night diner stories, their own dreams put on hold, their own struggles to balance responsibility with passion. "It's got over 100,000 views already," Joey said, beaming with pride. "And look, someone shared your actual recording." Sure enough, a link to Midnight Coffee Dreams had found its way into the comments. Rose felt the room spin a little. Her private song, her quiet dreams, were suddenly out in the open for everyone to see. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked Robert, waving his phone with a grin that could have lit up the whole city. "Had you seen it?" he asked, sliding into his usual booth. "The local radio station called me this morning. They want to play your song." Rose gripped her order pad tight, anchoring herself in the familiar feel of pen and paper. "But I didn't plan." "Sometimes the best things in life aren't planned," Robert said softly. "Sometimes they're just honest moments captured at exactly the right time." Throughout her shift, Rose watched as more customers than usual came in, phones in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of the singing waitress. Some asked for photos, others just smiled knowingly. But it was the ones who shared their own stories that touched her heart the most. The nurse who wrote poetry between shifts, the bus driver who played saxophone at church, the mechanic who painted beautiful landscapes in his garage. By the end of her shift, Midnight Coffee Dreams had been shared by a popular country music blog, and a local news station was asking for an interview. Rose sat in her usual spot by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. "Mom," Amy had said that morning before school, "does this mean you're going to be famous?" Rose had hugged her daughter close. "No, baby," she'd replied. "It means something better. It means people are listening to our story." Fame, Rose discovered, was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't bright lights and instant success. It was her phone ringing during Amy's homework time, local reporters showing up during her shifts, and her daughter's teacher calling about missing assignments. Reality had a way of keeping even the sweetest dreams firmly grounded. "Mrs. Chen," Rose said into her phone during her break, pacing behind the diner. "I know Amy hasn't turned in her science project. We've been dealing with some changes, but I promise we'll have it done by Friday." She ended the call and leaned against the brick wall, closing her eyes. The past week had been a whirlwind of radio interviews and local TV spots, all while trying to maintain her regular shifts and keep Amy's life as normal as possible. Inside, Jerry's diner had become something of a tourist attraction. People came from neighboring towns hoping to catch her singing, taking selfies at the counter where the viral video was filmed. Tips were better than ever, but the attention made it harder to focus on the actual work. "Order up," Joey called from the kitchen. "And there's another reporter asking for you. Third one today." Rose grabbed the plates, delivering them to her tables with practiced ease despite her exhaustion. She'd been staying up late recording more songs at Robert's friend's studio, using her tip money to pay for session time. The local radio station had started playing Midnight Coffee Dreams in regular rotation, and people were asking for more. "You look tired," Robert observed when he came in for his usual evening pie. He'd become more than just a customer now, part mentor, part friend, part guardian angel of her musical dreams. "Amy's teacher thinks I'm neglecting her education," Rose admitted, sliding into the booth across from him. "The diner's closing in 12 days. I've got 3 unfinished songs waiting to be recorded, and I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night this week." Robert pushed his pie aside, his expression serious. "Maybe it's time to make some choices, Rose. You can't pour from an empty cup." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A Nashville record label wanting to schedule a meeting. The same label that had launched some of her favorite artists. The kind of opportunity that most singers would kill for. "They want to meet next Tuesday," she said, staring at the message. "During Amy's school science fair, the one she's already struggling to finish her project for." "What are you going to do?" Robert asked quietly. Rose looked around the diner, at the regulars who'd supported her for years, at the new faces drawn in by her sudden fame, at the calendar on the wall marking the days until closing. Everything she'd dreamed of was suddenly within reach, but the cost seemed to grow higher every day. Her phone buzzed again. Amy's teacher sending a reminder about the science fair. Rose remembered her daughter's face that morning, trying to hide her disappointment when Rose had been too busy with a phone interview to help her practice her presentation. "I need to make a call," she said, standing up. Behind the diner, in the same spot where she'd promised Amy's teacher about the science project, Rose dialed the record label's number. "About Tuesday's meeting," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I can't make it. My daughter has a science fair, and I promised I'd be there. I know this is a huge opportunity, but she's my biggest hit song, if you know what I mean." There was a pause on the other end. "Actually," the label representative said, "that's exactly the kind of artist we're interested in. Someone real, with real priorities. Could we meet Wednesday instead?" Relief flooded through Rose as she agreed to the new time. Walking back into the diner, she found Robert grinning at his phone. "Your song just hit number 3 on the local country chart," he announced. "How does it feel?" Rose grabbed her order pad, expertly dodging a customer's attempt to film her. "Honestly, not nearly as good as it's going to feel watching Amy nail her science fair presentation." That night, after her shift, Rose sat at her kitchen table helping Amy finish her project about the water cycle. As they worked, she hummed a new tune, one about finding balance, about dreams that grow alongside responsibility, about success measured not in charts but in promises kept. "Mom," Amy said, carefully gluing cotton balls to represent clouds, "are you going to be too busy for this stuff when you're famous?" Rose pulled her daughter close. "Never. Some dreams you chase, baby, but the best ones. The best ones you build, piece by piece, making sure the foundation stays strong." 6 months after the viral video that changed everything, Jerry's diner looked different. The old neon sign still buzzed outside, but now it read Jerry's Music Cafe. The booths were still worn and comfortable, but they faced a small stage in the corner where a microphone stand caught the glow of soft lighting. Rose stood behind the counter, watching the Sunday night crowd filter in. She still wore an apron, still carried an order pad, but now she also had a guitar leaning against the wall behind her. A gift from the record label after she signed with them on her own terms. "You're sure about this?" Robert asked, sitting at his usual spot. He traded his customer status for official business partner when Rose had presented her wild idea 2 months ago. "Never been more sure of anything," she replied, pouring his coffee with the same care she'd always shown. The door chimed as more people entered, filling up the tables that now surrounded the small stage. The story of how Jerry's Diner survived was almost as popular as Rose's viral video had been. When the original owner announced the sale, Rose had taken the advance from her record deal and, with Robert's guidance, made an offer. But she hadn't just bought a diner. She'd bought a dream and transformed it into something uniquely special. "Mom," Amy called from her homework spot at the counter. "It's almost time." Her science fair project ribbon still hung proudly on the wall, right next to Rose's first album cover. A simple photo of her in her waitress uniform, holding a coffee pot and smiling. Rose checked the clock. Sunday nights at Jerry's had become something of a local legend. People called it Midnight Dreams Open Mic, a chance for other hardworking dreamers to share their stories through song. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rose spoke into the microphone, her voice carrying the same warmth it had when she was just taking orders. "Welcome to another Sunday night at Jerry's. As always, we serve dreams alongside our coffee, and everyone's story, it's a chance to be heard." The crowd cheered, a mix of regular customers, aspiring musicians, and people who'd been touched by her story. Her album, Late Night Confessions, had debuted on the country charts, but she'd insisted on keeping her shifts at the diner. It wasn't just about serving coffee anymore. It was about serving hope. "Our first performer tonight is a nurse from the city hospital," Rose announced. She wrote this song between night shifts in the emergency room. The young woman who stepped up to the microphone had the same look in her eyes that Rose remembered seeing in her own reflection. That mix of terror and determination that came with sharing your heart with strangers. As the night progressed, more stories filled the air. A teacher sang about his students' small victories. A construction worker shared a blues song about building dreams one brick at a time. Each performer got the same attention Rose had always given her customers: full presence, genuine interest, and a warm cup of coffee if they needed liquid courage. Between performances, Rose moved through the tables, taking orders and collecting snippets of new songs on her order pad. Her own music career was growing steadily. She had radio play, a devoted following, and a second album in the works. But here, in this diner-turned-music cafe, she'd found something even better than success. She'd found a way to hold onto her roots while helping others grow their wings. "You did good, kid," Robert said later that night as they closed up. Not many people would have thought to turn a closing diner into a launching pad for other dreamers. Rose wiped down the counter one last time, smiling at the marks left by coffee cups and nervous fingers tapping along to heartfelt songs. "I just remembered how it felt," she said softly, "having someone believe in my midnight dreams." Amy, half asleep in a booth, clutched her math homework and a notebook full of her own song lyrics. Rose had noticed her daughter starting to write her own stories, inspired by the courage she saw on stage every Sunday night. As Rose locked up, she paused to look at the old diner's window, now decorated with fairy lights that reflected like stars. The neon sign cast its familiar glow on the sidewalk, but now it illuminated more than just a place to get late-night coffee. It lit up a space where dreams were served daily, where stories were shared over pie and understanding, and where every voice got a chance to be heard. "Ready to head home, baby?" she called to Amy, gathering their things. Tomorrow would bring another day of balancing orders and autographs, another night of helping others find their voice while keeping her own song strong. But that was the beauty of it all. Sometimes the best dreams don't take you away from your life. They transform it into something even better than you imagined.